Let me welcome you to the second and final of the conversations at FAS this year. My name is Maya Jasanoff. I'm a professor in the history department. And I want to begin today by welcoming the Harvard class of 40. You're beginning your freshman year in 2036. It's Harvard's 400th anniversary. Now, you may have heard stories about the old days at the beginning of this century, when things around Harvard were really different. Back then, Widener Library was full of books. People checked them out. These were kind of heavy, chunky things, and they would put them in bags and carry them around sort of like snails with these great loads on their backs through the yard. Can you imagine? And what's more, many professors spent their time writing books in solitude. And the same faculty who were doing the cutting-edge research were also teaching undergraduates like you. Back at the beginning of the century, students used to go to class in Seaver Hall and the other buildings that you see in the yard. They attended lectures and section discussions instead of the way that you do your coursework now, which is mostly online through hands-on activities. Classes used to be held mostly between 10 and 4, the time that you now spend on your internships, your labs, your startups. Under the old curriculum, you were required to take fully a quarter of your courses in general education, in subjects outside your concentration, distracting you from the concentration that you had specialized in, the sort of solid, focused, skills-based education that we emphasize now. And the most popular courses then were called Ec 10 and Justice. Now, as you know, half of you are likely to take CS 50 before you graduate. Of course, in those days, most of the students were also on campus the majority of the time, and around 90% of them were American, very different from today when Americans are a minority at Harvard College. All right, I've just sketched out for you one vision of the FAS at 400, 25 years from now. How does it sound from the perspective of today, the FAS at 375? Is it tantalizing? Is it frightening? Is it a little bit of both? It's a vision that grows out of the new possibilities and pressures that are posed by today's technological developments and by, I think, its economic and cultural climate. In the last panel discussion we had here 3 weeks ago, my colleagues across the disciplines explored some of the exciting ways that the digital revolution is transforming what we can do as scholars and teachers. We heard about the kinds of discoveries that scholars can make thanks to exponential increases in available data, also thanks to rapid advances in instrumentation. We heard about how digitization allows scholars to undertake previously unimaginable projects, ranging from the detection of exoplanets through to the study of world literature. And we also heard about how teaching can happen outside the classroom as never before, and how undergraduates today can achieve the kinds of research breakthroughs that previously were thought to be associated with advanced graduate training. Among the various ideas that bubbled up from that last session, two themes stood out in particular. One of them pointed to the divergence between what students are taught to do and the skills they may actually use in their future careers, research careers or otherwise. In a changing knowledge environment, the panel concluded, the long-term winners are not going to be the people who have a set of easily outdated skills. They're going to be the people who can adapt, who can acquire creative, sophisticated ways of thinking and a diversity of experience. The other theme that emerged from our last discussion concerned the value of collaboration, whether by sharing access to research tools and facilities, or by crowdsourcing data sets, or by producing team-authored work. Wider access to information means that much less of an individual scholar's time these days is spent actually collecting information. Much more of it is spent analyzing and interpreting data. And these are activities that can be effectively shared across geographical boundaries, disciplinary boundaries, and also boundaries of career stage. So what are the implications of all this for the FAS looking forward? How should we structure the FAS of the future to facilitate and to award credit to collaborative undertakings? How should we organize a Harvard education, and what should be its priorities? The answers to these questions about the future may not require much prognostication. They may require taking a close look around at what we've been doing in the FAS up until today. So today, a different panel of experts will consider what aspects of Harvard's past and present might help us craft the FAS of the future. When we can achieve so much digitally and remotely, what should be the place of the campus and face-to-face interaction? When access to knowledge has become so much more widespread than ever, how can we navigate meaningful routes through it? As interdisciplinary collaboration has become increasingly vital for studying certain kinds of problems, what is the value of a discipline-specific training? And in light of our current concerns about competitiveness in a changing information order, I think of this as a kind of neo-Sputnik moment, which have placed renewed emphasis on the acquisition of pre-professional skills. What will be the value of a liberal arts Harvard College education? To address these questions, we have a model of collaborative interdisciplinarity in a team of 4 outstanding scholars. And I want to introduce them in the order in which they'll speak to you in today's session. Claudine Gay is a professor of government and African American studies. Her research and teaching focus on political behavior, public opinion, race, and ethnic politics. And she's studied subjects including the effects of descriptive representation on citizen engagement, political competition and cooperation between minority groups, and in particular, the role of neighborhoods in shaping political orientations. And this equips her especially well to speak to us today about the importance of the campus as a physical space in a digital and globalized world. Matthew Nock is a professor in the psychology department, where he directs the lab for clinical and developmental research. He's a prize-winning teacher as well as a certified genius. He was awarded a 2011 MacArthur Fellowship for his research, which aims to understand modes of self-harm, especially suicide. Now, how might an interest in self-destructive behaviors qualify him to talk about the FAS's plans for the future? I will leave for the audience to imagine. But having more than 100 published papers to his name certainly gives Matt excellent insight into the subject which he'll be addressing today, and that is the challenges of navigating through a world of proliferating authorship and scholarship. Rob Wood is an associate professor of electrical engineering, a core member of the WIS Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering. Rob builds robots. He is a founder of the Harvard Microbiotics Lab, where he runs a team of 40 researchers to create colonies of autonomous robotic bees. And I was hoping he was going to bring one of those with him today, but instead I gather you'll be treated to a video. He's also working on robotic centipedes, which might evoke different sensations in the audience. Among his numerous distinctions, Rob was named one of Technology Review's top 35 innovators under the age of 35. He's won an NSF Career Award. He's also won a Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, and that's from President Obama, not President Faust. His commitment to path-breaking innovation gives him unusual insight into the topic he'll be addressing today, and that is the enduring value of the disciplines. Parimal Patil is professor and chair of the Department of South Asian Studies, one of the FAS's newest units, where he focuses on Indian philosophy and religion. In his own words, Parimal is committed to looking for religion in all the wrong places, by turning to classical Sanskrit poetry, logic, and philosophical texts to understand the origins of South Asia's religious traditions. Parimal's research ranges across ethics, aesthetics, theology, historiography, and literary criticism. He's also a lapsed biochemist, which primes him to talk to us today about the place of the liberal arts in the FAS at 400. So following these presentations, we'll open the floor to questions, but without further ado, let me invite Claudine up to the podium.
My colleagues who were on the first of these panels a few weeks ago worried aloud that only fools tried to predict the future, and there's probably something to that. But my worry today is a bit different, and it's that my nostalgia for the present is going to mark me as something of a Luddite, but so be it. So my charge was to make the case, or at least make one case for why the campus matters. And as Maya indicated in her introduction, I'm a political scientist in the government department. And I'm interested in the political attitudes and behaviors of the American mass public. So in effect, how do ordinary people approach politics? And at the center of my research is the simple proposition that the political lives of ordinary people are profoundly shaped by the social, political, and economic environments in which they're embedded. And so the kinds of questions that have animated my research include things like, do you live in a place where voters of your political party essentially control election outcomes, like Republicans in Oklahoma? Or do you live in a place where your group is outnumbered and consistently outvoted? Do you live in a place where there's a strong norm of civic participation, where every block is littered with campaign signs during election season, and where people queue up bright and early at their polling places? Or do you live in a place where most people don't have the foggiest idea how to register, let alone who the school board candidates are? Do you live in a place where most of your neighbors look like you and live like you? Or do you live in a place where you actually pretty regularly come into contact with people from all walks of life? Do you live in a place that is awash in libraries and community centers and public parks? Or do you live in a neighborhood where there are very few amenities, few services, and really no place for your neighbors to gather? And so the answers to these kinds of questions have implications for activities as varied as whether or not you vote, which political candidates you support, the stereotypes you hold, and for your preferences on public policy. And there's a large literature to which I've made some contributions that really documents the many ways in which citizens are not unmoored social isolates, that in fact they live and make their decisions in place, in neighborhoods, on the job, in schools, and that these sites are defined by a variety of things, including the kinds of resources and opportunities they provide, the burdens they impose or relieve, and the kinds of social observations and interactions that they facilitate. And as a consequence, what we learn and experience within these physical environments have consequences for our decision-making about politics. And so given that this has sort of been the through line in all of my research, it should come as no surprise that I consider it really, almost virtually axiomatic that the physical campus is the vital center of the university, and that it should remain that way as we go forward into the future. So just as an atomistic view of citizens is a really poor description of the political lives of ordinary people, it's also a poor description of the academic lives of students and scholars. And the campus, and really just more generally the principle of on-site learning, is critical in so many ways to research, to teaching, and to our work lives more generally. And let me just offer a couple of examples. So one way in which is important is that we all know that discovery is not possible without dialogue. Good ideas, which are really the currency of academic life, don't just spring fully formed from the minds of a single scholar. At least that has never been my experience. They often just begin as intuitions and uncrystallized thoughts that slowly take shape through conversation with our colleagues, conversations with our students. And so, how is it that you figure out, which of, say, a half dozen half-baked ideas are actually the ones that are worth pursuing more fully? And for that, you need dialogue and you need community. And the campus, this shared physical space, the meeting rooms and the lounges, the libraries, the cafes, the computer clusters, the food trucks in front of the Science Center, and how these spaces are configured, not as sort of some kind of sterile corporate grid, but with angles and curves that really force us into contact with one another. All of that can foster the kind of community that really creates opportunities for dialogue. Another way in which the campus is really important is in the lives of students. So, it's here where students are exposed to a range of views and a range of values, where they begin to form social networks. They're oftentimes much broader on multiple dimensions than the ones they left behind at home or the ones that they build online. This is where they come and are recruited into activism, recruited into community service, recruited into academia or the arts or business. And this is where they're able to access and mobilize resources that for many of them were unimaginable back in their home communities. And so in a lot of very practical ways, the campus makes a difference. And so these, are not revolutionary ideas, and I'm not presenting them as revolutionary ideas. To the contrary, they're almost quaint, if not anachronistic, in a world that seems to be trending toward the virtualization of everything, where well over half of the country's largest colleges and universities, based on enrollment, have fully online degree programs, where distance learning, rightfully so, is touted for its flexibility and cost effectiveness and its success at expanding educational access, where one evangelist from the virtual world described in a recent article in the New York Times, described the traditional classroom as, just one node in a wide network of social interactions and not particularly significant. And where students with the choice actually often opt to watch lectures online rather than attend the same lectures in person. So to argue in this context for the brick and mortar campus really kind of marks you as a throwback in a world where the idealized vision of the future is one in which it really doesn't matter where you are. You can be a student, certainly taking a course at Harvard, but live in Doha. And I don't doubt the power of the internet to really transform in very beneficial ways how education is delivered and how we as scholars collaborate and create knowledge. The news this fall that this artificial intelligence course at Stanford that was offered online for free attracted 160,000 students, that's pretty amazing. That's very exciting stuff. I wouldn't describe it as going to Wonderland, which is how the faculty lead for the course described it, but that is pretty exciting. And Harvard obviously should be part of that kind of a transformation. And when groups, more generally, when groups of unrelated individuals from unknown geographic locations convene online, there is the potential for genuine insight to emerge. And I certainly don't deny that. But even if you wholeheartedly believe in the promise of this sort of future virtual campus, which hopefully looks something like this, even if you believe that watching lectures online and tweeting with your TFs and participating in seminar discussions via Skype or some other technology we haven't even thought of yet, even if you think that bundle of activity and technology will come close to being a reasonable facsimile of what happens on a brick and mortar campus, and so the brick and mortar campus could go away, you're not really being fair if you don't also take into account those random 5-minute conversations that you have with students who are milling about after lecture, or that fortuitous encounter in the yard when you realize a colleague that from another department has already collected the data that you've been searching for, or the tent encampment that you and your students pass each day, and that becomes the shared experience that you can discuss and debate in the classroom. And if we're really honest with ourselves, I think we'll recognize that to the extent that we value collaboration and interaction, and we believe that they advance our teaching and research, that it's in these kinds of moments and at these sort of informal sites all around campus where a lot of that happens. It doesn't just happen in the structured environment, say, of a lecture hall or a seminar room. And yet, those structured spaces are exactly what the virtual future seeks to emulate. And so we're talking about the difference here between posting an anonymous help request on a website like Stack Overflow or some other sort of technical website, and then sitting back and waiting hours and maybe even days for an equally anonymous reply to come back to you. The difference between that and just standing in your colleague's doorway while she quickly dispenses with your technical question and then suggests an alternative approach to the entire research project. So in a world where technology enables us to micro-target and to self-select into ever narrower social networks, where we can find the blogs or the wikis or online journals or chat groups that are targeted just for our demographic and are tailored just for the set of scholars who are working in our particular research area. In that particular context, the brick and mortar campus is one of the few places left where the caravans meet and where there's a really great potential for the kind of intellectual serendipity that drives research and teaching. So this, I think, is certainly one of the cases for the campus now, and I hope it will continue to be the case when Harvard celebrates 400.
Thank you all for coming. I want to start out by saying thanks to Dean Smith for putting this series together. I've been following online, and I think it's been really a wonderful opportunity to think about the present and the future. And thanks to Maya for putting this panel together, and thanks to my panelists for the discussions that we've had leading up to this. Now it's all making sense. They assigned to the guy who studies self-harm to talk a little bit about the peer review process. And so that's how I'm going to use my next 7 minutes. Before doing that, I, of course, want to make a quick comment about the dangers of trying to predict the future. And as somebody who, as a psychologist, focuses on trying to predict self-harm and suicidal behavior, or trying to predict people's behavior in the future, I know how difficult this can be, especially as we're predicting many years out. This is true trying to think forward about how things are going to be different in the future, as well as thinking about things that we have in the present that we want to bring with us into the future. And many people, much wiser than myself, and I know that casts a very broad net, have thought about how things are going to be in the future and look pretty silly in retrospect. And this is true across a range of different areas. This is true in technology, government, the arts, and my personal favorite, the letters. Which is really interesting if you think about it. Nevertheless, knowing the dangers of doing this, I'm going to use the few moments that I have to talk about one thing that, as panelists, we thought would be really important to bring with us into the future, and that is our peer review system, our system as scholars of reviewing the work of those around us, the peers in our discipline. And I want to start out also by acknowledging, brief disclaimer, I know that each of us engages with the peer review system in a different way. Some of us are focused on writing articles, some on books, and so on. So I just want to state what my what lens I'm bringing to view this issue and what my experience has been. as a psychologist, I have some colleagues here in the psychology department, we're primarily focused on conducting experiments in laboratories in the psychology department. So we apply for research grants, conduct these experiments, and report the results in scientific papers. So much of my lens has to do with attempting to obtain federal funds to conduct experiments and then reporting in scientific journals rather than writing or reviewing books and other materials. And so much of my experience with the review process has come as a reviewer of grant proposals and of journal papers. And here at FAS, I've had a wonderful chance to engage in the peer review system by being the current chair of the IRB. Thank you for no booing and hissing. And also, as a researcher, I've had the chance to write grant proposals and write papers for scientific journals, and I've had the wonderful opportunity to receive feedback from peers much smarter and wiser than myself. And as I think about the peer review system, and as we were talking about what do we want to bring with us in the future, and someone suggested the peer review system, I initially, between us, I'm among friends, had a really aversive response. And I thought, I don't like the peer review system. It's a very difficult system, and I've, between us, fantasized in quieter times about what the world would be like without peer review. I'd have a lot more time on my hands. I would be much more productive. I would cry less frequently. So if we can only bring a few things with us into the future, is this really one we want to bring with us? But upon reflection, I think it absolutely is. And I would argue that this is something absolutely vital to all that we do as scientists, as scholars more generally, for a number of reasons. If we look back across the history of time, which began in 1636, we see that we weren't always fortunate enough to have peer review. So the first peer-reviewed paper appeared in the scientific literature not until 1665, so until Harvard's about 30th birthday. And the first peer-reviewed journals didn't appear until about Harvard's 100th birthday. And peer review in scientific publications increased fairly slowly over time, and it hasn't been until Harvard's been about 300 that our leading journals in science and medicine have routinely used, uniformly used peer review. And this increase happened for a number of reasons, primarily because of the need to manage the increasing volume and specialization of work sent into journals. Early on, of course, there was an editor in, say, a science journal or medicine journal who was knowledgeable enough to review all the papers that came in and to make determinations about which papers should and should not be published. But as this volume increased dramatically and as fields specialized increasingly, there was a need for more reviewers. And now I think there is a strong consensus that we need peer review for all of the reasons listed, to help us evaluate the strength and likely impact of work, to ensure high standards, to provide feedback, to try and improve the work that appears in the scholarly record. And so I would argue strongly and somewhat confidently that peer review is here to stay. Many of us have problems with the peer review process. It does have limitations, but overall surveys suggest that the majority of people using peer review are satisfied or very satisfied with the process. However, as Maya mentioned, this is a changing time that we're in. We're in the time of the digital revolution, and so this has brought many challenges currently and looking forward to the future that I think the peer review process will need to deal with. I think the largest among them is the unbelievable explosion of information at the hands of society. A long time ago, there was a relatively few elite who were able to read and write and publish and disseminate that information to others. And now, any of us can at any point in time pull out a device out of our pocket and muse on anything we can think of and post that online for the world to see, which is great. It's great that so many people can produce this information and share it. But what this leads to is an overwhelming amount of information to us as a society. And we need to have a system to separate out misinformation from true information in the area of science, non-science from science. As a psychologist, I think I see that most people's view of psychology comes from places like television and movies and radio and blogs and so on. Very different material than what is in the psychological scientific literature. And so it's a peer review system that makes that distinction, makes that separation. And I think for that reason alone, it's going to be really important for peer review to continue into the future. And to make determinations about what gets admitted to the scholarly record. Even within the scholarly record, though, we're seeing challenging times. There is an overwhelming amount of information appearing, and peer review needs to help us better organize and navigate across that information. We're seeing in the past several decades skyrocketing numbers of academic journals appearing in print, where we now have, by different estimates, between 10 and 25,000 journals. and even more exponentially increasing numbers of articles appearing in print, with now about over 1.5 million new articles appearing in the literature each year. So even within the scientific, the scholarly record, we're seeing huge numbers of publications. How do we make decisions about where things are published, what gets published, and how to navigate across them? And these are, I think, very real challenges for us moving forward. With increases in science and technology, we're seeing the flow of information across scientific disciplines, which has led to an explosion in interdisciplinary work. But as knowledge has advanced, we're also seeing a burrowing down and increasing specialization within areas. This map shows communication across different scientific disciplines. This is a map based on citations over a 5-year period of over 6 million citations in 6,000 different journals. And what it does is plot out for us scientific space, each node being a different field, and links across nodes representing citations. So for instance, links from A to B represent area A making citations to area B. And so the links show us how much one area is citing another, with the color and width of lines representing higher levels of citations. And you can pick your own area and see where it fits and what it's connecting with. The point of this being, we're seeing great increases in interdisciplinary work and work being done across nodes at an increasing rate. And the peer review system needs to be able to manage this in terms of having people who are knowledgeable across disciplines to be able to evaluate work. We're seeing journals and societies develop to help facilitate this interdisciplinary nature of work. At the same time, we're seeing a burrowing down. So we just pick one area, my favorite, psychology and related fields, and we take a closer look. We see even within disciplines, we're seeing a wide array of subspecialties developing all around, say, psychology. So we see much stronger links across disciplines and many subfields forming. And again, for these reasons, we're seeing an explosion of information, and we need to better organize this complexity moving forward. Last 2 weeks ago, the panelists discussed the changing nature of researchers with much more emphasis on large-scale, multi-site projects. This is true in lots of different areas, and I think really has strong implications for how not only research is done, but how it's reported in terms of authorship, submission of scholarly work, and review of scholarly work. As just one example from my own area, I'm involved in a project with colleagues here at Harvard, the World Health Organization World Mental Health Survey Project, where we're looking at suicidal behavior in 28 different countries around the world. And so we have a network of collaborating colleagues in these 28 different countries with a dozen or so people in each team collecting information about suicide, sending it here to Harvard, to my colleague Ron Kessler at Harvard Medical School for analysis. And so we're trying to understand risk and protective factors for suicidal behavior. It's a wonderful project, and it's producing interesting findings. But what we're seeing is that we're having to make new decisions that we didn't have to make before about who's an author on these papers. Only a fraction of people involved can be an author on any given paper. And here we see several different multi-author papers with lead authors coming from different countries. Where do we submit these papers? What country do we submit them to? What language do we write them in? What kind of review process should we undertake? Should we review internally? In what way? How do we review internally before we send out for external review? So all sorts of new issues are emerging as we're changing the way that research is done. With innovation, we're also seeing innovation in the way that the peer review system works. And I know that Maya said if I go over 7 minutes, bad things will happen to me. So I'll go more quickly through this part. We're seeing changes in how peer review gets accomplished, with a big difference being, do we have an open peer review system where, say, articles are posted online openly for then the world, one's colleagues, people in the world to comment on and post comments on. So it's a transparent process. So it's an open process. Or do we want a double-blind review, where the reviewer does not know the identity of the author in order to decrease the likelihood of bias, which we know occurs in the peer review process. Interestingly, about 75% of authors prefer double-blind to open review, but we're seeing open review increasing in different areas. There's also debate about, should we require authors to submit data with their papers, and should these data be made available online for people to examine after the fact? And there are interesting arguments that maybe we'll discuss today on both sides of that debate. So we're seeing a changing landscape. I hope we can have a discussion about some ways in which the future of peer review may look a little bit different. I'd like to end by just making a few predictions for 2036, and so I would ask that microphones and cameras be turned off at this point so I don't look silly in retrospect. So these are just a few musings about how things might be different in the future. One is, I think review is going to happen much more rapidly than it does today. Gone are the days where we write a paper, we print out several copies of it, send it to the editor, he or she sends it out to reviewers and brings it back, and it takes months to hear back. Now, 75% of journals have fully electronic submission and review. And so we're seeing potential for rapid review. The average reviewer spends 6 to 8 hours actually reviewing a manuscript, but sends it in an average of 24 days after receiving it. So there's a lot of time in there for a much more rapid review. Will it hit 24 hours? I don't know. It's possible, but I think we could certainly have a more efficient review system, and this will lead to a more rapid advancement in science. I think there will be increasing transparency in the review procedure, more online posting, more online reviewing for a number of reasons. I think this is going to be a good idea. And we're also seeing a move toward open access to peer-reviewed publications. The DASH system at Harvard is a nice example of this, and there are other examples in various universities and fields, and I think this is definitely the way of the future. And finally, and I think most importantly, I hope you'll join me in this last effort. I really think it's high time that we get rid of the C, the X, and the Q. They're unnecessary. I was able to steal an issue of Science magazine from 2037, and an economics journal. We just don't need the C, X, and Q. And so hopefully, Harvard of 400 will see this change happen. Thank you.
My name is Rob Wood, and I'm going to talk to you about the role of the disciplines in Harvard at 400. And I'm going to start off with a disclaimer, though, and you'll find that this disclaimer is taken from some of the principal canons of many of the professional engineering societies, which are, for example, the American Society of Mechanical Engineering, National Society for Professional Engineering. Almost all of them have this disclaimer where engineers are only supposed to practice in their own fields, so therefore I'm only going to talk about science and engineering topics. But I invite you to draw parallels where appropriate to some of the topics that I'll discuss. So my work, I believe I'm somewhat qualified to discuss this because I work on a large number of, or I work on a large interdisciplinary project called Robobees. And that topic is trying to develop a colony of autonomous robotic bees. And I could tell you more about that later, but what I want to do is use that as a sort of motivating example of an interdisciplinary project and the sort of the different connections between the disciplines that go into this. And so I'll start with a couple of videos of an actual bee, and use this to sort of pose some questions. This is a bee. This is a bumblebee. This is doing a relatively simple maneuver. It's just taking off from a flower and flying away. So I would ask you questions like, well, what is the structure of the wings, and how are the wings interacting with the air to produce thrusts and torques? What are the thoracic mechanics that are moving the wings through the air? What are the muscles that are powering the thoracic mechanics that are moving the wings through the air? What are the metabolic processes that are providing energy to the muscles that are moving the thorax, that are moving the wings? What are the controls that are going on here? How is it navigating through its environment? How is it, what are the sensors that it's using to avoid this flower, avoid obstacles, or find its hive? And all sorts of really interesting topics. We could go on and on with this, and I hope that it'll be very obvious that these topics, if we were to study these in even in a biological context, but even in a broader context, bring up many disciplines. Here's another example which maybe exacerbates this. This is now a fly doing maybe a more aggressive maneuver, but just thrown in there to sort of maybe exacerbate some of the challenges that would need to be solved if we were to make a robotic version of these devices. And so here's a recent instantiation of a robotic bee, and to study the different aspects of this, we have a team of experts in some of the following areas. I'm not going to list them all, but I'll just give you a sense of the sort of scope of topics that we're trying to address here. Things like bio-inspired design, fluid mechanics, meaning how are the wings interacting with the air, solid mechanics, how are we actually designing the structure of these devices, what materials are going to go into those devices, how are we going to actually build these devices, what fabrication techniques are available to us, what transducers, what sensors and actuators are going to be involved with these sorts of devices, how are we going to power them, what sort of controls are we going to use that couple with our sensors and actuators to for example, stabilize flight. How are we? One of those classes of sensors might be vision. regardless of what sensors, what actuators, what control structure we have, we're going to have some new computer architectures that are going to control flight, but do this in a way that deals with the severe mass and power limitations of such a device. And many computer science topics involved in, well, how do we actually program swarms of these devices? There's many other topics which I can get into. I'll give you a sort of a, maybe zoom in on a couple of these just to sort of highlight some of the interdisciplinary connections that we have here. This is a video which is going to show how the Robobees are made currently. And this involves a combination of micromachining and actually concepts related to origami. A lot of different materials that are going into this. We layer these materials, we machine the materials, and then we sort of pop them up almost like a children's pop-up book. And so this took quite a lot of effort between people with backgrounds in material science, with people who are mechanical engineers, with people who are electrical engineers thinking about the electrical properties of these materials, and of course a lot of engineering design. In this particular case, of course, there's a lot of bioinspiration too. So we worked with a number of biologists to try to extract out some of the key insights from these biological systems and apply them to our devices. So there's quite a lot going on with how these devices are actually made. How they're actually operating in air, I'm hoping that this is somewhat clear, but this is a wing flapping through air. It's slowed down quite a bit. This is actually moving at 100 times a second. And this is in an effort to try to understand what we refer to as the structure-function relationships for these flapping wings, either the natural systems or artificial systems. And so this involves a broad team of biologists looking at how actual insects fly and stay aloft and maneuver, to people like us who are more experimentalists who can construct these devices and run some of these experiments in a variety of controlled conditions. And the last example I'll give is involved with controls. How do we actually think about, this is a very early flight. We have much better videos, but I didn't bring those with us yet. So thinking about questions like control, like I said with the actual bee flying, how do we integrate sensors and control architectures and new computer architectures? And this basically involves the entire set of co-PIs on the project. So that's just one example, okay? And I hope that you will easily believe that you know, with all the PIs, there's about 11 co-PIs on that project, and they span biology, material science, applied math, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, computer science, and other topics. But that's just one example. And when I was thinking about, well, what are other interdisciplinary examples of either centers and institutes, et cetera, at Harvard, of course, this is not an exhaustive list, so I apologize if I left your favorite institute at Harvard out. These are the ones that I'm either associated with or familiar with. But if you look through these, things like the Wyss Institute or the Center for Brain Science or any of these, I pulled these quotes directly from their webpage that describes this center or institute, and not nearly all of them say interdisciplinary education, interdisciplinary research, drawing on faculty from throughout Harvard or even neighboring institutions. And so I think that's really interesting. That there are almost countless examples of these interdisciplinary projects and initiatives throughout Harvard. And that brings me to I'm going to raise more questions than I answer. I'm not going to try to do too much predicting. But I'll say a couple of obvious things. One is that these sort of initiatives, these sort of centers, could be the groundwork for new disciplines, okay? And I'll give some examples on the next slide. This of course, happens. And I'll give some examples with respect to some engineering disciplines, but I'm sure this happens in other areas as well. So the question is, if these sort of more interdisciplinary projects, centers, institutes, et cetera, work well and are attractive from an academic perspective or to our students, to our sponsors, whatever, then why do we need the more classical disciplines? Can we just forego the more discipline-specific training and go right into these interdisciplinary projects? Well, my sort of obvious answer, which you can guess, is that no, indeed, we do need very strong, solidly grounded disciplinary training, and we will need that to continue for Harvard in the future. And the reason is quite simple. We need to have, in order to make a big impact on our areas, for example, trained as an electrical engineer. We need to have a firm basis, a firm grounding in understanding what people have done before us, so we can build off of that and actually make deep contributions in our areas. Maybe these interdisciplinary projects, for example, like Robobees, facilitate some of that by getting new perspectives from different disciplines, but nonetheless, all of my students, myself, all of my co-PIs have very, very solid discipline-specific training. And this came up in a discussion that I was having with one of my colleagues very recently, Professor Mahadevan, whom I'm sure many of you know. And we were discussing how engineering, for example, is an inherently historical discipline, meaning that for whatever we do, nearly everything we do is built upon previous discoveries. And so it's very important that, especially for younger students, for example, that they understand and have a deep training in previous discoveries, and so that they can contribute further and build on top of that previous work. So I will end with just a few final questions that this might pose. And some of these might be obvious, so hopefully some of these are something that we can discuss perhaps in the panel. So new disciplines will emerge, but in what areas? So this is sort of an obvious question, but perhaps very difficult to predict. But to give some perspective on this, things like bioengineering, which is extremely strong at Harvard and extremely strong between Harvard and its associated medical schools and in Boston in general, well, that's only 30 to 40 years old as a discipline. So this is within the sort of order of magnitude of the span that we're talking about here. More close to some of the things that I do, robotics is starting to emerge as an actual degree program in many good places. And so this is actually happening, even though the term robot is only approximately 100 years old. These are actually a couple, and there's a bunch more examples of how new disciplines can emerge from some of these combinations of various different disciplines. So another question is, how will our interdisciplinary projects and institutes evolve, and how will the role of these initiatives shape the current existing disciplines that we have? And lastly, and I think most importantly, is what is Harvard's role in the evolution of the disciplines, and not just from the perspective of training our own students, but from becoming a leader worldwide. I think we obviously realize that we're in a state of leadership for in a variety of ways for how things can evolve academically. And so the question would be, how can Harvard lead as these disciplines evolve? So with that, I will stop. So.
Thank you too to Maya and to Mike Smith for organizing these panels and to all the great conversations we've had leading up to this. I have the enviable task, I suppose, of trying to talk about the liberal arts and its enduring value in 7 minutes. And so I think I'll just start. In a recent op-ed piece in the New York Times, Larry Summers refers to a remark by Derek Bach, who compares the challenges of reforming a university curriculum to moving a cemetery. In the context of Bach's remarks, what are remarkable are the changes that are in fact happening on our campus and the rapid rate at which they are occurring. The pace of these changes is evident from the many manifestations and transformations in course content and pedagogy brought about by Gen Ed, and the remarkable changes in research and teaching that my colleagues outlined in the first of these FAS conversations. As we move past Harvard at 375, the pace of change in our campus invites us to consider what has sustained us over these centuries, and therefore might continue to do so as we move forward towards Harvard at 400. My perspective on all of this comes from my own work on classical South Asian intellectual practices, which begins with the hypothesis that the smartest people in the history of our world did not just write in English, French, German, Greek, or Latin, but they may have also written in Asian languages, and especially classical Sanskrit. Learning from the work of Sanskrit intellectuals has helped me to appreciate the importance of the modern liberal arts to the future of our campus, and to better understand the vital role that they should play in our future. For the next few minutes, I want to share with you a Sanskritist perspective on the core of the modern liberal arts, that however the liberal arts may change, and however the liberal arts may have changed and will continue to change, we should maintain as central to our educational mission. To me, modern liberal arts include not only the classical trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, but also biological science, subfields of engineering, literature, mathematics, social science, and physical science. In other words, all of the conceptual vocabularies and intellectual practices that we currently rely on to understand the world and our place in it. What we need to try and maintain, in my view, is our commitment to two core academic values that I see reflected both in the work of the Sanskrit intellectuals that I study and in the work of my colleagues on the Future of the Present panels. The first is what I call the value of slow academics. The Sanskrit intellectuals whose work I am trying to learn from share with my colleagues on these panels a deep commitment to details and to modes of analysis and interpretation that occur at a level of specificity that those outside the academy often have difficulty understanding. To learn something new and to learn how to preserve good, hard-won insights in the form of an argument is not easy. It is the seemingly trivial details involved in experimentation, sifting through historical archives, learning foreign languages well, textual interpretation and criticism, philosophical argument, and mathematical and statistical analysis that are crucial for real learning. Yet, this is time-consuming, tedious, and results are rarely guaranteed. Such an inside-out approach is also fueled by curiosity, an intellectual virtue which all too often is dismissed, especially in our increasingly professionalized and results-oriented culture. For effective research and teaching in the future, however, we cannot lose sight of the importance of what is too readily dismissed as merely old-school modes of attention to detail, analysis, and interpretation. To stay ahead, it seems to me that we really must slow down by building in slow, non-instrumental, detail-oriented learning into our otherwise fast-paced and goal-driven campus. A second value of the modern liberal arts that I think is exemplified both by the Sanskrit intellectuals that I study and my colleagues on these panels is the importance of talking to all the wrong people. That is, to colleagues from whom one could learn, but with whom one might never think to speak, and with whom you are likely to disagree. To foster genuine collaboration and conversation across boundaries of various kinds has been a core value of the university. And so one might think that universities are model institutional contexts for fostering friendships between colleagues, and more specifically, the kinds of friendships that provide a basis for genuine, heated, but intellectually productive conversation. Yet, as we are faced with ever-increasing professional demands and the challenges of striking a balance between our research, teaching, and families, there's relatively little time to invest in our colleagues, and especially those in far-flung departments and fields. As a result, we don't really seem to know each other, and even worse, to understand, let alone appreciate, the work that our colleagues in different divisions really do. Although our students are not as isolated from each other as we are, they too rarely understand just what it is that their friends study or appreciate why it has value. In my view, the cost of this for our community and for our research and teaching is very high. We are fractured and therefore not as strong as we should be. In response to this, I think we need to recreate ways of bringing the wrong people together in contexts outside of committee meetings in which sustained, non-instrumental, and radically interdisciplinary learning can take place. Perhaps it is time for us to take each other's courses, and especially those that we find to be the most interesting, but the least relevant for our own research. As we look ahead to Harvard at 400 and 500 then, I think we need to renew our long-standing commitments to slow academics, to talking to the wrong people, and to developing a sophisticated vision of the ways in which relevance and value are rightly attributed to academic work. A vision that I think will only come from understanding each other very well. In conclusion, I thought I might share two short poetic verses from classical India, which convey for me a fundamental insight that lies at the heart of the liberal arts, and an insight about the benefit of the liberal arts that is also accompanied by an implicit policy statement on how to realize it. First, the pedagogical insight. The verse goes like this. It's Padam acharyat adadyat, padam shishya samedhasa, padam kalena labhate, padam sa brahmachari bihi. It says a student takes a quarter of what she learns from her teacher. A quarter comes from her own intellect. A quarter comes in good time, and a quarter from the company of her peers. And finally, the benefit of the liberal arts and its implicit policy statement. The verse goes like this. Pradnya vivekam labhate bhinnay ragama darshanaihi kiyatva shakyam unnetum swatarkam anudhavata. learning becomes increasingly powerful and fine-grained only when we consider a variety of different knowledge systems. After all, to what extent can we really improve by merely following our own reasoning? Thank you.
From ancient languages to prognostication, we've heard wonderful descriptions and discussions of the value of, among other things, serendipity and getting voices of different fields and disciplines together in the same room. And so in that spirit, I'd like to spend the next half hour having a conversation among us all. But since I know that it usually takes an awkward 1 or 2 minutes in the Harvard DNA to come up with some questions, while you formulate, I hope, the many questions that you'll have, let me throw one out to the panelists and get your responses on this. You know, we tend to be certainly surrounded by messages that suggest that the digital revolution is all to the good, right? I mean, that obviously it has enabled certain kinds of access, it's allowed certain kinds of breakthroughs. Some of the work that those of us in this room do would not be possible without the kinds of technologies and access that we have. I wonder, though, if you might speculate a little bit about what you think the greatest liabilities of the digital revolution might be for the things you're concerned with, or for university community more generally, or Harvard in particular.
I'd say that one of the things that makes me particularly concerned is that with so much data and information so readily available, you know, so much online and at your fingertips, and as students become increasingly skilled at sort of manipulating technology so that they can harvest that data and use that data, I'm realizing they're not always terribly as resourceful as I'd like them to be, as I think that, you know, good scholars need to be when it comes down to tracking down information that's not readily available, that's not already online, and certainly not as critical and sophisticated as I think that they need to be in how they consume that information. And this is, you know, kind of a generic concern that I have that has been particularly highlighted for me just this week in particular. I'm teaching an undergraduate research seminar this semester, and one of the big goals of the class is to help students develop an original research paper. And for many of them, sophomores and juniors, this is their first major research paper in their time at Harvard. And some of them, you know, are developing these papers in anticipation of eventually writing a senior thesis. And the assignment for this week was to submit their research designs. So, you know, they've already identified the question they're going to pursue, and so this week is about kind of mapping out your plan for answering this question. And every single one of them in their research designs have included Wikipedia as a major data source. And, you know, I use Wikipedia, but, you know, to figure out, like, you know, what the time zone in St. Thomas is, you know, not literally for research. But this is not, you know, I understand that it's useful and it's relevant, and I don't want to dismiss that, but getting students to realize that not all knowledge is contained in Wikipedia or online, and that some of what is contained in Wikipedia and online is not knowledge, is just incredibly difficult. And yet I think it's getting them to appreciate that and to become as equally skilled in finding data and analyzing it as they are in manipulating technologies to harvest data that's already there, is something that I'm finding increasingly difficult to instill.
Yeah, I have one which I have a slight worry about, and I think this echoes something that Claudine had said, which is a potential de-emphasis of hands-on learning. And so, in particular in engineering and in some sciences, there's been some fantastic, you know, online virtual tools that could be used to visualize or analyze or play around with different very complicated subjects, and I think that's fantastic. It's a great tool for accelerating understanding of those topics, but not as a substitute for experiential learning, hands-on learning, in particular in engineering and in labs. And that sort of fits directly within some of the areas that I teach in, for example, engineering design. And without core lab experiences and the like, then students, I don't think, will be very successful in that.
So this is a question, I think, for the entire panel. One of the things that I get to do right now is I'm serving on a committee at the National Science Foundation to think about how we might change peer review and do peer review virtually. So what Matthew talked about was the exponential rise in publications, which means for an organization like the National Science Foundation, the ability to bring together everybody to DC to sit in those closed rooms and read all those papers and talk to each other and score them and all of that, which was a horrible experience no matter what you say. And they buy you bad lunches and everything. So now the idea is to sort of create a system. And there were other problems associated with it. In other words, it became increasingly difficult to have diverse peer review committees because it was harder and harder for people from various parts of the country to get there. Some people would, if you came from the West Coast, you had to take 2 days to be on a peer review panel versus somebody from here, and it's an hour-and-a-half flight. So they were worried about a number of things, and that's why the idea of sort of testing out a new virtual peer review system came about. So not to be too long-winded, but the question I have is, what we have in those systems then are, we are looking at a screen now from our own offices. The screen has little photos of everybody sitting in their offices. It has a PowerPoint of the paper up on the other part of the screen. There's a place on the side to do a blog and annotate as we talk. I can't think. I don't know. I mean, and it's really a difficult, complicated set of things that is being asked of us that we do from our offices that was very different, to Claudine, than when we sat together in those round tables and complained about the bad air. So I think, but also something fundamentally different happens, I think, when we do it in isolation versus, as I'm trying to read the annotation, from people I've never met before, often on those peer review panels. I don't think I know as much as when I was sitting in the room. So over the course of the day, I began to understand a particular scholar's perspective on various things through our interaction, through nuance, listening for nuance in their responses to various proposals. So a lot of more complicated things are going on. So it seems to me that that says both that space matters, but also that peer review is more than space and the papers and the proposals. It's actually creating a community of people who can begin to trust one another's judgment. And so what I wonder is, to what extent, for you, Matt, to what extent is this sort of, do you think that we need to be together in order to build a particular component of peer review, which is trust in communities of scholars as they review each other's work? And then to Claudine, how important is space in a deeper sense? I mean, is space critical to, physical space critical to a particular kind of peer review, or is it all ancillary?
It's a really interesting question. I think it ties together a lot of what we talked about and raises some interesting challenges. I mean, on one hand, we do peer review now of, say, scientific journal publications. We're not all sitting in the same room. We do it. We get the paper. We review it. We send a review in, and it's synthesized by the editorial staff, and that seems to work well. But I think you raise a nice point. In larger scale reviewing, like in reviewing proposals that come in, there's something that happens synergistically with people in the room that I think many people would agree is really valuable. And just free associating a little bit, I mentioned this large-scale cross-national study that we're working on. So we have researchers from 28 different countries, and wow, wouldn't it be great just if everyone Skypes, but now you've got 90 people on your screen, and it gets to be very confusing. We meet every year for a week. We meet somewhere around the world in the same place, and this is funded by the federal agencies that fund this research. And initially, they said, we're going to pay for you to go to Amsterdam for a week to look at windmills and talk to other people. This doesn't sound like science. And the argument was made, no, we meet, and we spend the day meeting, talking about the project, and then we have social events that are, I think, key for bringing the group together. And in those meetings, not just the scientific ones, but over dinner, we talk about ideas and things develop. So there is something, I think, really valuable that happens when you have people in the same place, in the same space at the same time for a sustained period of time. So, and I think it is a balance. I think in some contexts, you don't need to bring everyone in. In other contexts, there is something really, some value added that occurs. And I think it's just finding which need people there and which can benefit from advances in technology. And you can't Skype everything, which I think leads nicely into Claudine's discussion of, can we do lectures with people in their rooms, or is there something that happens in a seminar room where everyone is meeting in the same time at the same place?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually just second what Matthew was saying, and I think that the extent to which sort of the nonverbal ways in which people communicate when they're actually in a shared space, as well as sort of offline interactions that take place, are really key to forming the levels of trust that's necessary for something like peer review. And then in addition, the advantage that's created by actually being in a shared physical space is that you're free of the distractions. So I mean, one of the things about having everyone up on a screen is that you could also, be doing email on the side. I mean, there's so many other things that can happen, which don't happen when you're together in a physical space and having an unmediated interaction with other people. And so there is not an easy substitute for capturing that element that's created by actually bringing people together. It's obviously not efficient, and there are probably certainly faster ways of doing peer review, but it's not clear that the quality of the decision that emerges would actually be enhanced by not having everyone together in the same room.
I think one question we can ask about this too has to do with interdisciplinarity and whether, in fact, sort of gathering these teams in one place is of added value, or whether you think, whether you could do the same kind of thing, or not the same kind of thing, but something like the same kind of thing with a big, huge monitor and 50 people. How would you talk, I'm just curious how you would see the added value of having people physically together and these kind of informal interactions and social
actually, so this is a good question, and I'm fortunate enough within the project that I was discussing that actually 9 out of the 11 are at Harvard. So, and I think that's sort of a rare thing. That's actually what we sold to the National Science Foundation to do this was, we are in close proximity. We talk to each other basically daily, and not only that, more importantly, of course, our students interact together and mingle on a daily basis. I think I can't quantify that, but I think that there's an extraordinary amount of added value that you get from that. I'm on another larger project which does not have those interactions, and it's much more distributed throughout the country. And although we think it's successful, it doesn't have that sort of camaraderie that you have with locality. Yeah.
I'm also working on a collaborative editing project, and people are all over the world. And I think if we did not already know each other fairly well, this would not have worked. We wouldn't continue. It would be too difficult or too boring or too dull or not effective. And so there is something to that, and how to talk about it and how to preserve it when it needs to be preserved and let it go when it doesn't, I think is a challenge we're all going to be facing.
Well, it seems to me also linking Evelyn's question to Claudine's comment about the liability earlier, that there's a risk that people are losing the ability to capture nuance and understand the limits of the information available to them. Similarly, what you would gain in a face-to-face interaction, as Evelyn pointed out, is a greater sense of where somebody's judgments are coming from, for example, what's informing their perspective. And these kinds of things tend to get flattened out, it seems to me almost literally, when a lot of our exchanges are mediated by a computer screen and you have less to go on.
I wonder about a lot of these issues that you all are talking about from the perspective of the learning experience for the students. All of this, proliferation of too much information with Wikipedia and everything, and thinking that that constitutes doing research, and all of these distractions that we have with our iPhones and our iPads and everything, being able to actually focus on doing the work that's expected of us. I'm just curious on your thoughts of how students' learning experience is changing for the better or for the worse with all of these technological advances.
The one thing, I started thinking aloud here, the one thing that I see that, one of the many things that I see that's changing is again, in the approach that students take to finding information. And sort of the best metaphor I can use is, the difference between, going to Google Books to find, the exact book that you're looking for versus, going over to Widener, also, knowing exactly what shelf you want to go to find that book, but then once you get there, realizing that there are these other books that are kind of near it that you either didn't know about or maybe you kind of forgot about and you want to reread, and it opens up opportunities for inquiry and for knowledge gains that are not available if you're just doing Google Books. And that, to me, when I think about my own experience when I was here as a graduate student, it's so different from the experience both that my current graduate students as well as the undergrads have. And I think that the Widener experience, that kind of, the literally browsing and kind of seeing where that takes you, I think it's part of a wholly different approach to data collection, So, it wouldn't even occur to me to just, for example, just go to Wikipedia. And even if I were looking, so I have students who are just going to Wikipedia to get census data. Like, how about just going to the census, It's like there's a lot of knowledge contained just on, so I'm not saying don't rely on a website, but how about going to the source? And while you're there, you might realize, oh, there's, I could also not just be getting the data from the population census, but also from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Or, there's so many other things that are available if you don't just go to Wikipedia and type in, I need to know the racial composition of some county in Oklahoma.
Well, I would add to this also that I think that there's an illusion with the digitization of everything, that it is everything. Mm-hmm. And the limits to knowledge online are things that I think, well, none of us probably have a very concrete sense of, but students in particular. I mean, we all are old enough to have gone to Widener and browsed around books, which I think many undergraduates now probably don't really do at all. And so there's this sense that everything is there. And as a result, I think the risk is that students lose the ability to understand what the sources of the knowledge are, what may be left out. The other point here would be that a lot of these repositories are in their infancy. So, for example, Google Books is digitizing fast and furiously, and it's wonderful in terms of making available the contents of a library like Widener to the world. But the keywords, for example, that are attached to a lot of those books are incredibly misleading. And so, for example, if you're browsing and you're relying on those kinds of keywords to do the equivalent of glancing down the shelf for you, you may be led off in all kinds of strange directions. So I think it's very important for us educators to recognize that students are going to be accessing information through these new means, but also to help convey to them the skills with which to understand what the limits are, why one thing may lead to another, how cataloging is ineffective, and all the rest of it, and to make them push past the Wikipedia, as you say, and go to the source.
One thought that I had was a flip side of, or a positive of students' abilities now for using newer technologies is I think there are opportunities to do things, certainly in psychology, that we have never been able to do before. Some of the most exciting work, in my mind, being done in psychology is using real-time monitoring. A lot of what we have done over the past 100 years in psychology is bring people into our laboratory and test them in our labs. Now, with portable and wearable technologies, we can go out into people's lives and collect information from them in real time. And some of the most exciting work being done in this area is being done by our graduate students who are really good. I can barely spell iPhone. They can program the iPhone in a way that can collect information from tens of thousands of people over time. And so there are, familiarity with newer technologies, I think, can be a real benefit in terms of what type of research is done. But I do think that, I agree, there's nothing like hands-on learning. And so a lot of data are being collected online. There's nothing like having your hands on not literally, the person you're studying to be able to interact with them and try and understand mind, brain, and behavior. But I think there are definitely pros to more familiarity with technology that we're seeing.
Thank you. What do you think are the good effects of 25 or more years of serious, thoughtful, slow studies of what are called non-Western humanities in Harvard University? What could be the effect?
Or what could be the
Yes, what
effect?
could be the effect?
Wow.
And what has been up to now, because there has been a serious also study up to a point, up to now.
I guess I'll say two things. The first is, like with all research, you just don't know for sure, right? So I think 25 sustained years of studying non-Western literature, philosophy, whatever, history of science, I'm not exactly sure what the transformations would be. So I guess one thing is we're just not sure. But one thing I can say is that, and this is just an example, is I really think that one thing we've done is we've been good about learning about the rest of the world. We haven't been so good about learning from the rest of the world. And so the question is, are there shareable theoretical insights in the work of, say, philosophers from different cultural contexts, from the work of literary theorists from different cultural contexts, that can actually change how we go about looking at things we've already seen? Can we learn to see things in new ways from new theoretical resources from other places? I would say that's one thing that we could definitely do. And I think that definitely will happen as we begin to investigate what other theorists from other places have said about topics that we actually care about.
As a small note, I rather wonder if we're going to divide the world into the West and the non-West in 25 years. We've already run up repeatedly against the limits of those kinds of terminologies.
So in our opening remarks, Maya, you presented some rather provocative scenarios for Harvard at 400, such as virtual classrooms. Students are no longer coming to campus. But what if a less extreme possibility would be that Harvard students are still in physical classrooms in front of real faculty, but suppose it were really easy to bring into the classroom virtually folks from distant places. Suppose a computer science course was simultaneously enrolling engineers who work at Microsoft or Facebook or some other company that might exist in the future. Or suppose a course in Chinese history is also engaging with Chinese scholars. Or suppose you had a course in foreign cultures that actually has students who live in those foreign cultures interacting with Harvard students. Wouldn't there be some value in having a scenario like that evolve, where it were really easy as ordering a data projector for your room to bring in those other people, those other audiences?
From an engineering perspective, I think that would be fantastic. And so one of the things that I'm involved with is trying to teach engineering design. And one of our thoughts is that there's no better way for a student to learn engineering design than from a real engineer. And somebody, when I say real engineer, I mean somebody that's working in the engineering field, for example. But it's not always easy, for example, to find them and those that are willing to come in and talk to the students. And so if there's a way to facilitate that, I think that could be win-win for everybody involved.
I too think all these things are potentially really useful. The key is potentially, right? When we imagine what it would look like, I think I only see really upsides, because I see benefits that we couldn't get by just somehow bringing new communities of people together on campus. What I'm not sure, though, is getting back to something we've all talked about, which is this value of getting communities together, people together, maybe the wrong people together, or in your sense, the right people together. How we actually create those communities in a classroom in a way that's going to be effective. It's one thing to connect everybody online, I think, in a virtual classroom, and I know how difficult it is to do that, to create a vibrant community in a classroom that's physically here. And maybe it's just a limitation of what I think my skills are. I'm wondering how I'm going to do that when I have this classroom with people from different places and different parts of the world who I only see and talk to on this 1 hour or so. And I don't know enough about them to really fashion the kind of community that I think is necessary for some of the kind of learning that we're trying to do in some of our classes. That's just my own perspective on it. But I would love to try. I think it would be a great experiment.
Yeah, I want to raise this issue of interdisciplinarity that has been raised and try to imagine its shape in Harvard 400. I wasn't here last time, so this may have been covered last time. But as that list of interdisciplinary projects went on screen, the one thing that, of course, struck me was that the list that was there was in particular very much inter-science type of centers, interdisciplinary projects. And it started me thinking that this whole notion of interdisciplinarity long, long, long ago, it arose in humanities. And that's where it took particular shapes. And now it seems to have taken a different shape and become more shifted into sciences. So I'm wondering if this is some sort of unintended effect of technologization and digitization of learning, and how else could we imagine interdisciplinarity in 400 if the kind of slow down, let's learn differently that was emphasized by the last speaker, and this whole issue of the synergy of face-to-face teaching and learning in actual physical spaces, how can we imagine that an emphasis on that might lead to a different way of imagining interdisciplinarity at 400?
So first, I think that the list, of course, was generated based upon my bias, and that's just because those are the ones that I'm familiar with. Although I did do some searches and found, of course, countless others that had nothing to do with sciences per se. But I mean, if there was a different model where it's, you know, as engineers, for example, we could find some value from interacting with any other discipline, non-science discipline, then I think that would be fantastic. You know, I'm not sure how that would be necessarily facilitated. I'm not sure if this happens in other places throughout the university, if there's any models that currently exist for that you guys might be aware of. But if there is a way to facilitate that, then I mean, I think that would be great. I'm not sure how to do that, but or how that would look like. But
revive the faculty club.
Yeah.
It's interesting what you said there about interdisciplinarity having emerged from the humanities and gone science. I think the boomerang has come back a little bit in the sense that the concept of the lab is one that I hear people talking about all the time, right? And so maybe we can have a humanities lab, so to speak, in which certain kinds of problems are approached. And I think that suggests the beginnings of a new way of thinking about the relationship between, for example, a senior scholar and a team of graduate students that is certainly applicable to the humanities. There are certain kinds of research projects that we do that could benefit from this sort of scientific model. So, I mean, even in the notion of interdisciplinarity and how it's executed seems to be an interdisciplinary phenomenon in this way.
I really liked what Professor Gay said about the value of the campus, and I just wanted to add to that I think it also enables the students to really get to know their faculty, and I think students crave those interactions. I've been to, and I'm sure several people in the room have been to these student-faculty dinners, and they're perennially oversubscribed. There are always more students who want to be there than there is room. And they also want to have their teachers and their faculty members there for support. So I sometimes get emails from students in the engineering design class that says, well, I'm going to be working tonight, you know, myself and another student are going to be working tonight. Will you be there? And it's, well, do you need me there? Do you have questions? No, I just want you to be there. And that's kind of a nice thing.
Yeah.
So I think it enables that as well.
Well, I think that's actually a great note to end on as the clock hits 5:30 exactly, because one of the things that I know we on the panel found, and also in connection and in collaboration with the four on the previous panel a couple of weeks ago, is that the value added of getting people into the same room across disciplines in unusual combinations is really tremendous. And so I'd actually like to thank Mike as well for making this happen, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending and making this conversation happen. And I hope, finally, most of all, to thank the panelists for what, for me, certainly has been a very stimulating set of sessions. And I hope, above all, that the spirit of this, that we will talk to each other in the same room, on the same campus, across divides, will carry forward in the weeks and semesters ahead. So thank you very much to everyone.